you guys so much. We are still in the mental consciousness structure. This is going to be part 2 of that. Who knows if we'll get to part 3. That depends on timing. Because there's so much in this section, we'll just get right into it. I'm going to reread the last paragraph that I left off with in the last video, and then we'll continue on. Quote, Gebser says, "Nonetheless, it was this same theory in which the shift of emphasis resulting from mutation took shape that gradually displaced the importance of the chorus in favor of the individual, and this meant that man stepped out of the shelter of the group which previously surrounded and protected him like a cave. This group spirit attains a kind of awareness of itself for the first time in the Greek chorus, where it became voice and word. Stated differently, the self-contained group began to express itself, to press its inherence outward. It began to act and separate, and in this separation placed the ego outside of itself. This brought about a further stabilization of the mental structure. The actual awakening to the mental consciousness took place in the Dionysia. There, under the patronage of the male god, the process of integration was completed. The emergent consciousness of its polarity initiated by menace, which made possible directed thinking. And we would note that this process can only be represented as integrative if we observe it, as we are, from the standpoint of the mental structure, that is, in retrospect. Viewed from the archaic structure, it may seem to be a process of disintegration and dissolution. The psyche relinquished its polar incontestability, its certainty, and undiminished effectivity when its dominance was displaced by mental thought. So when the ego and when the mental consciousness structure emerges, it's never this smooth, pleasant, nice transition where everything is easy and everything fits in its perfect place. It just doesn't work that way. Anytime a consciousness structure mutates and we shift from one, or we add one and reincorporate it into the totality of our psyche, you expect some turbulence ahead. Always do that. Always expect that. Okay, let's see. All right, so now he's going to talk a little bit about more differences from the mythical consciousness structure to the mental. He says, even though these processes are still clothed in myth or mystery, it is no longer merely the pictorial or imaginative element of the mythical structure which suffuses them, but rather the outline of thought and directed conceptualization which they reveal. This is a big point. One of the big differences between the mental and the mythical structure is, remember, the mythical structure was the shaping and crafting of images in the imagination to touch aspects of the soul, to carry the spirit forward. They understood through crafting images in the imagination. It wasn't a matter of abstract, dispassionate, logical thought. It was, let me imagine things and put it into a narrative, which will then communicate the idea that I'm trying to express and guide us individually and as a society. In the mental consciousness structure, it's different. Think laws of logic, rationality, directed discursive thought, directed conceptualization as opposed to imagination. All imagination is a product of the mythical consciousness structure, and if you're using it, you should become more aware of the aspects of the mythical consciousness structure so you can use it to its full effect. He continues. The difficulties against which conceptualization struggled are more intelligible if we recall the psychic and vital profusion inherent in every word at the time. Each word was the flaring up of an aspect of the psyche and the visible psychic reality which, undifferentiated, includes the one or the other aspect of the same word as a kind of sympathetic vibration. So remember, in the rational mental world, A must be A cannot be B and C and D, or even just B at the same time. The polarity, the circle, has been replaced by duality. No longer are they similar, and you can have this complementing and corresponding way of viewing it. Now you must rationally reconcile them because they are different. You cannot have them at the same time. They are two different things. Problem is, when trying to denude, in order to assign the word one definition, you must have necessarily denuded it from all of its previous definitions, which one in the magic realm is always going to express a unity. So there's going to be a ton of different definitions, a lot of which the mental structure are going to classify as contradictory. Excuse me. And then you still have the mythical too, where still you have this polar complement aspect, and he's going to go on later to get into the digression of primordial words and their roots, which will explain this more clearly, so don't get frustrated. But the point is, these words didn't just have one set, rigid meaning. If they did, it just wouldn't make sense. They're either express a unity or polarity, so there's always going to be difficulty in adapting from the unperspectable world, essentially, to the perspective world. Now, as he said, every word invokes a different aspect of the psyche. The psyche is consciously known but quantifiably immeasurable. We can't really tangibly grasp on to its contents. It's symbolic, it's interpretive. Everything I said in the mythical video. And in doing so, there's going to be some difficulty making that switch from what is quantifiably immeasurable and consciously known to what is quantifiably measurable and consciously known. He says, this wealth of connotation in each word, which to us appears like an irritating hyperfertility where even the unspoken aspect is conveyed, pose nearly insurmountable difficulties of expression to early philosophical attempts. This is most clearly evident if we examine the surviving text of the earliest natural philosophy, that of the Ionian school, of which Parmenides' theory of being is an eloquent example. It required centuries to sufficiently devitalize and demythologize the word so that it was able to express distinct concepts freed from the wealth of imagery, as well as to reach the rationalistic extreme where the word, once a power and later an image, was degraded to a mere formula. So it's a little preview on some of the deficient aspects of rationalism. It reduces words which are symbolic, which at their best can hold a wide wealth and variance of interpretations that can be illuminating to life. Instead, they have one definition. As I said, A can be A and not B, and they get plugged into formulas. And the further and further you go out, these symbols mean absolutely nothing. They are completely divorced from reality, and it makes you wonder why we even have them in the first place. Turn the light off. There we go. All right. Let's see. Let us observe for a moment Parmenides, and especially his pupil Zeno, who defended the ontology of his teacher in Athens around 450 BC. What is the result of this defense? The conception of being attendant upon thought includes also the question of space. W. Capell entitles a summary of these fragments of Zeno. Zeno's comprehension of being as only spatially extended being, but the decisive fact is that space assumes form in conceptual thought and philosophical statement and formulation. So the discovery of space, the way it is expressed philosophically or in the world of the thought, metaphysically, internally, where obviously there's a space between my two hands. I can physically account for them. Remember, I don't know, just pick anything. Nature, culture, nature, nurture. The space is in between the binaries. There is a space, and even when thinking, you can carve out thoughts and spatially classify them and put them in a certain container. So you can say, we're going to bracket that, and that's what that means. And you can separate it from other concepts and ideas. And you can say, okay, on one hand, we have this. On the other hand, we have this. That spatial emphasis is being applied to thought. Let's see. This far-reaching and extremely complex question as to the connection between thinking, being, and space, which could expose several considerations of present-day existential philosophism as mere pretension, since they have, quote, fallen for mere empty formalism, led Zeno to those arguments that mark him as being the first relativist. They prompt him to the incisive formulations that give rise to dialectics, which in turn led via Socrates to logic just one generation later. And with logic, we step out into the clarity of thought where we can breathe freely after having been only too long devoted to magic darkness and mythical twilight. Let me see. I'm going to reread that. Okay, so he continues. To be sure, we cannot yet speak of complete mental clarity at the moment when Plato becomes a pupil of Socrates and makes his indelible impression on the Athenian Academy. Clarity is where there is no further search, yet it is precisely this search for truth which supplants truth itself that was characteristic of Socrates and even of Pythagoras. So no longer was truth the ultimate means, the ultimate end goal, the ultimate good. Instead, might wait to make this point until we get specifically how rationality brings objects in the world into relation with each other. But the point is, rationality compels further division and further deeper understanding where you can never essentially arrive at one ultimate truth, because whatever ultimate truth you're going to arrive at can only be understood by positing its antithesis, and then we'll get there. The third act of rational thought, to rationally reconcile them, or measuring thought, excuse me. The point is, what was true originally isn't really a final truth. It is just another binary, one or the other binary. It just becomes something else that has to be divided and further understood by positing its antithesis. So you haven't really come up with a permanent answer or solution. You've come up with a temporary answer that will necessarily become just a part of a later equation that you're going to have to solve. Let's see. One of Plato's maxims derives from Pythagoras, the first measurer of Western civilization. The maxim which Plato ostensibly inscribes over his door reads, Medis, I'm not even going to try. No one unversed in geometry shall enter. In order to estimate or adjudge something, we must be able to measure it. And more particularly, whoever would gain patriarchal supremacy over the mother and mentally establish man, that is, the human being, as the measure, must be able to measure the earth. Geometry is, after all, earth measurement. Here we find the clear and still qualitative expression of that relationship between man discovering his mentality in the earth, a relationship which has reversed itself since the definitive victory of the deficient mental, that is, rational structures. Since that time, the primacy has passed from man back to earth. It is the earth's red which glows on the revolutionary flags. Having once ordered the chaotic mess and detached himself from it, a process mirrored by the image of the human head on ancient coins, the individual now threatens to resubmerge into it. Again, the beauty of rational thought is when it sectors off whatever is quantifiably measurable. No one unversed in geometry shall enter, and geometry is earth measurement. Rational thought is a thought that measures, it calculates. The beauty of it is it takes the whole of any situation, it sectors off that which is quantifiably measurable and consciously known, and as long as it stays within this little triangle, within this sectored off part, you can get some very clear, definitive answers. Of course, its deficient nature is also present in this little example, because you just sectored apart from the whole, and now you're pretending the whole is the part, or the part is the whole, excuse me. So anything that is not quantifiably measurable and consciously known, that doesn't get accounted for in rational thought. Now, the problem is not that. The problem is the over-reliance. The problem is when you say, no, only that which is true by means of rational thought, that's exclusively true. That's rationalism. You don't want to do that. He says in the mythical structure, their form of expression was the mythology. In the mental structure, it is the philosophy. But while the mythology has universal validity, each philosophy has merely an individual or specific validity. The proliferation of philosophical systems is accompanied by a proportional decrease of mythical elements which survive in weakened form in religion and legend, and in diffuse form in the fairy tale. They disappear almost completely in the saga after having attained a highly rationalized form. So this is what William Irwin Thompson was talking about in The Great American Replacement of Nature. He wasn't talking about that much. It was just a casual reference. But he said the new consciousness structure creates mental models, and it essentially deconstructs or dismisses or derides or supplants the old ways. So it used to be myth. Mythology had a way. Mythology was simply taken more seriously. Religion was taken more seriously. What else did he say? Legend was taken more seriously. And that was the sort of world on its own. But now that the philosophy has come on, and that's a product of the mental structure, and the mental structure is now more efficient than the deficient mythical. Now philosophy is going to be taken more seriously than mythology. But the problem is, as he said, and Bergson makes this point, I wish I would have brought it down, in this amazing book, The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. If you want to get into philosophy as a layman, this is the book to read. Don't read it anything else. This is the best. But Bergson made the point that, I guess Nietzsche almost did too, where I think Nietzsche said, what a philosopher contributes to the world is not the house that he built, but parts of the house that will remain. And it's our job to pick out the bricks from each house and put them together and build a new house that will ultimately stand. So philosophy usually has one particular, what did he say? One individual or specific validity, whereas mythology is so all-encompassing and expansive. and it covers like literally the entire cosmos. That's universal. That's not a singular validity. That is a universal validity that confers psychic unity, which the mental consciousness structure tries to emulate, but does so unimpressively. All right, now we're going to move on a little bit. Okay, he said the directedness inherent in the mental structure, which around 1500 gave rise as a measure of its quote sense and right sequence, i.e., logically and consequently, which around 1500 gave rise as a measure of its sense and right sequence to perspective as the distinctive mark of our perspectival world, and initiated its sectoring, its specialization, and ultimately its spatialization. For from the beginning, the one-sidedness. Oh, I'm going to read. The way he wrote this was odd, so I'm going to try that again. The directness inherent in the mental structure, which around 1500 gave rise as a measure of its sense and right sequence to perspective as the distinctive mark of our perspectival world, and initiated its sectoring, its specialization, and ultimately its spatialization, bore from the beginning the one-sidedness that embodies the greatness as well as the ominousness of this structure. The one-sidedness is found to be in the identification of rightness with directionality and judgment. If you've seen my videos about killing rationalism, I have talked about this. Now we're getting into it. Rationality identifies correctness, as he said, with direction and judgment. If I say Barack Obama is 9 feet tall and 500 pounds, the direction is toward Barack Obama and the judgment is his weight and height. We can rationally account for this, and it is either true or not true. It cannot be both at the same time. In this case, of course, it would be not true. But you saw the direction, and then we make a judgment. Quote, it is true that this identification greatly strengthens everything pertaining to the conscious, i.e., everything measurable or moderated by consciousness, but it takes place at the expense of what we call the unconscious, the immeasurable and immoderate. There you go. Quantifiably measurable and consciously known. Science, math, history, basic common sense from day to day, like I said, the Obama, that kind of stuff. That's great. That's fine. Just don't let it encroach in areas where it doesn't belong. The unconscious, which we'll get to later in this series, it's a completely ridiculous framing. The unconscious, spirituality, dream interpretation is not conducive. None of those are conducive with rational thought. It's just absurd. The rationalists walking around, and we let them walk around with their little bow ties and their rational radars going into areas where they simply don't belong and where they're wholly inadequate. I made the disclaimer in the first part of this. I'm not going to rant. I'm not going to rant. I failed there. I failed there. But this is what rationalists do. The unmeasured and autonetic, that is, self-thinking world of mythical images has no place in the world measured and thought by man. At best, it is assigned a place in opposition, for there is no bridge to the inestimable in the world of measuring thought. In terms of measurement, it does not exist, or at the very most, it exists as non-being. Moreover, the thinking man turns away entirely from the past and is supported in this by religion with its notion of redemption. Religion, which in faith or belief furnishes the last remaining tie to the world of the immeasurable and irrational, is in consequence placed in dualistic opposition to knowledge. This is where the atheists get this idea of you either have religious faith or you have rational knowledge, or you have truth or knowledge. And of course, when they don't say rational knowledge, because rational knowledge is presupposed. They simply cannot conceive of anything else. So we have belief, which is based on ignorance, and we have knowledge, which is based on, guess what? Knowledge. This is everything depends on how you want to define knowledge. Or excuse me, I take that back. Everything depends on how you want to define faith. So you could just define faith as a belief in the irrational or what cannot be rationally considered to be true. You could define it that way. Or you could define it as the belief that something is true or is likely to be true. So when an atheist turns his car on in the morning, he believes in the principles of science. Now, he would say, sure, but the evidence that I'm pulling from is a lot better. Sure, I'm not trying to have that conversation right now. But the point is, everything depends on how you want to define faith. And what you're noticing is faith in opposition to knowledge. This is hallmark rational. Dualistic, like I said, they are different. They are not compatible. They do not complement each other. They do not correspond to one another. They are different and they must be rationally reconciled, usually either by privileging one of the two or creating a synthesis. Let's see. Let's see. Measurable and rational consequence. To the thinking person, the past exists only to the extent that he can measure it or fix its outlines with dates. As for himself, he one-sidedly sets his sight on the future, particularly as he thinks from his anthropomorphic attitude that he can shape this temporal sector at will, as if it were dependent on him. In view of the one-sidedness, the error of judgment is unavoidable. So the way rationality sort of deals with history is, again, it sectors apart from it and transposes the whole onto the part. So we have what can be quantifiably measurable and consciously known. And admittedly, I love history, by the way. I'm not saying history has no value. I'm after this, I'm going to read Will Durant's Story of Civilization. So please don't misunderstand. We have a tendency we say history works this way. And how do I know? Because we've recorded it and this has happened, and that will inform our worldview. The problem is that's only what's able to be recorded, what's quantifiably measurable, consciously known. But of course, we know that there was a whole world of human interaction that was not recorded for whatever reason. Either they didn't have the consciousness yet to do it, or the records were lost, or the culture didn't believe in it, or whatever it could be, or a natural disaster came in and blew everything away, and now we can't get anything. The problem is we have a tendency to take what we have and pretend that's all there is. Don't do that. And he's going to bring this back up again when he makes a critique of Spengler. And I think his definition of history that he likes is attributing sense to the senseless, because it reincorporates this idea that you don't have everything. But there's some things you can know, but not everything. The partial negation of the past, the extent that is unmeasurable, a result of the directedness striving toward the future for its own sake, is one of many dualistic manifestations of the mental structure. Duality is characteristic of this structure to the same extent that polarity is a hallmark of the mythical structure. Repeat for emphasis. Duality is characteristic of this structure to the same extent that polarity is a hallmark of the mythical structure. As important as polarity was to the mythical structure, which I hope to have made clear in my mythical video, and which we will make more clear when we talk about the soul later on in this series, that's how important duality is to the mental structure, to the rational structure. You do not necessarily have to posit everything in a dualistic way. For me, good and evil are no longer things that are placed in opposition and I'm trying to rationally reconcile, which means increase the good and decrease the bad. I don't think that's how the world works. I take a more mythical understanding of good and evil and recognize them as polar complements, two halves of the same source, and that has conferred not only psychic unity and sort of contentment to me, but I also think a greater understanding of the world. I think it has to be that way. But that's a big deal. Duality is a big deal. You do not have to rationally reconcile everything. Quote, but duality differs in one essential respect from polarity, and polarity correspondences are valid. Every correspondence is a complement, a completion of the whole. Whatever is spoken is corroborated by the invisible and latent unspoken to which it corresponds. In the polar unperspectable world of the mythical structure, both the voice and the muteness appropriate to myth, what is spoken and what is left unsaid, are correspondences and complements to each other. That's a big thing. And we'll get to maybe I'll talk about it when he does the digression into primal words. If I were to say, I think he uses this example. Father, let me see. War is the father of earth. So that's a statement. Let's say I read that in some ancient philosophy book. If I were to say that in 450 BC, Greece, if I were to say war is the father of the earth, even if everyone who heard that would take that and run it through the mythical consciousness structure, and they would say, and peace is its mother, and peace is the mother of the earth. Do you understand? Everything has a corresponding and complementing, even if it was left unsaid, even if no one else said it. They didn't have to say it because that's how everyone understood it. Everything was in the circle. Um, so that's what he's getting at. But now, of course, like I said, things have changed. What is spoken and what is left unsaid are correspondences and complements to each other. They suspend and supersede the polarity, returning it to near integrality, to an identity that nonetheless remains diminished, since its archaic authenticity seems to be irrecoverable. It is a recompleted, not a complete identity. But with respect to duality, we cannot speak of correspondence or complementarity as we could in the case of polarity. In the mental realm, we can never speak of something, but only determine something or conceive of it. Duality is the mental splitting and tearing apart of polarity. And from the correspondences of polarity, duality abstracts and quantifies the oppositions or antithesis. Whereas there is a totality, even though deficient, which can be recompleted in the form of complementarity within the mythical structure, from duality only a deficient, because unstable, form of unity can be realized as the unification of opposites in the third aspect. What the hell does that mean? Remember the magical consciousness structure. Remember the unity conferred by the magical consciousness structure. That unity conferred with it psychological unity and belief and purpose and well-being. You may ask why we even feel the need to rationally reconcile anything. As you just said, we are trying to re-attain that unity that was once so important and a product of the magical structure. Now, the mythical wasn't as good as the magic because that was unity, and mythical is polarity. So now we have two instead of one. Now the two unite and complement each other. That confers unity, but not to the same high degree that the magical structure does. The problem with the mental structure is its divisiveness. Every division that it makes divides the unity of the psyche. And so what happens is, remember, I don't even know if we've gotten it, but the binaries that are rationally reconciled, they no longer complement. They no longer complement each other and correspond. So the unity that is conferred is lesser because we're just kind of doing this better or worse reconciliation or synthesis, and that's just kind of supposed to work. But the problem is we're compelled to keep dividing and keep dividing and keep dividing, and then eventually we're not going to find any unity at all. It's just going to be disunity, which will in turn lead to chaos. So if you need more unity in your life, obviously you want to try to achieve, so to speak, integral consciousness, but also revert if you need to an efficient and healthy mythical consciousness, so you can be in that protective circle and you can no longer be disheartened or um, upset by the disunity and the division in the world and how nothing really makes sense and everything's chaotic. Here we encounter again the relation of the mental to the magic structure, inasmuch as the mediating or reconciling third aspect aspires to a unification. This unstable form of unity is expressed by the fact that the antithesis or contraries are only able to beget a third element in a temporary for better or worse union, a tertium, which is again separated at the moment of its birth. Accordingly, it does not represent a new unity, but merely a quantity that becomes dependent on its antithesis or opposite, with which it in turn creates once more a momentarily unifying tertium. Excuse me. I'm going to read that again for emphasis. This unstable form of unity is expressed by the fact that the antithesis or contraries are only able to beget a third element in a temporary for better or worse union. Just sort of talked about that. A tertium, which is again separated at the moment of its birth. Let me see. Remember what I said. Rationality compels you to keep dividing because whatever we have the dot on the binary, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. We just two dots, right? And then we invoke the third aspect of measuring thought. So we have the triangular thought like rationality. The problem is this right here is not the end. It will never be the end. Whatever judgment you reach, you are compelled, the way it brings the objects into the world into relation with each other, it necessarily requires this either opposite, antithesis, or different thing that it can compare to, so it can confer sort of absolute or irrational meaning. So whatever you have simply becomes one dualistic aspect of the next binary that must be reconciled. So now you keep going. And if I had a giant piece of paper, I would just keep going and keep going and you keep going. And rationalism is when rationality no longer confers clarity, but confers obscurity and complete divorce from reality and leads to chaos, both physically and metaphysically. Let's see. Accordingly, it does not represent a new unity, but merely a quantity that becomes dependent on its antithesis or opposite. As I just said, whatever judgment you make, you are compelled to keep dividing. This is why I believe, it's funny, I actually heard someone talk about this today. I don't think you can have a theory of everything. I think by definition, whatever judgment you come to, well, how do you understand that? Well, you're going to eventually posit its opposite. Well, we've figured it out that the color white is, or the color black is the theory of everything. That's the answer, the color black. Okay. Well, what is that? Well, we can think of its opposite, the color white, and now we have a greater understanding. So yeah, I it could be wrong. If you're a scientist out there, please prove me wrong, but whatever. In this, we see a further characteristic of our civilization, quantification. For the unification or synthesis via a third element can never be completed in time, only in the moment. The third element, freeing itself, becomes the procreator and carrier of one of the contraries able to engender a new unification and synthesis. So with quantification, there is if I'm doing a survey or if I'm doing a study and I'm quantifying whatever it is that I'm doing the study about, let's say it's about smoking rates or whatever, what am I doing? I'm only quantifying a certain moment because the study does not incorporate time, and quite frankly, these guys don't have the budget to do this. Time is duration, right? So whatever result you get is only going to be the result of certain people at a certain day on a certain moment. It is important because you can get a snapshot, but there is a reason why political campaigns do multiple studies, right? And they'll do them closer to the election. Why? Because they recognize time is even subconsciously, time is a creator of space, and things change. Things accumulate, different things happen, and people react psychologically to them, which could change their opinion that you have quantified just 4 months ago. So now your quantification is going to be a problem because you quantified only one moment and then things changed and now you have nothing else to go by. Let's see. Okay. I don't know if I missed this, but let's just be very clear. Here's how rationality operates. It takes the whole of anything and sectors off what is quantifiably measurable and consciously known, as opposed to what is quantifiably immeasurable and consciously known, like maybe the internal contents of our psyche or soul. What is quantifiably measurable and consciously unknown? What is quantifiably immeasurable and consciously known? In matters of qualitative valuation. All those do exist, but rationality sticks only with one. Quantifiably measurable, consciously known. How specifically does it bring objects in the world into relation with each other? By positing one thing that is quantifiably measurable and consciously known, and then positing another of the same form, and invoking the third aspect. So we have the dualistic binaries, they form the base of the triangle. Then we invoke the third aspect, that of measuring thought that measures, analyzes and calculates to formulate a directed judgment, like I said, usually by either privileging one of the two, hello Derrida, or by creating a synthesis. Problem is, as I said, whatever you come on, whatever judgment you make, only understood by positing its antithesis, then we restart. That is how rationality operates, my friend. Let's see. Now it gets in a little bit of examples of this. Although Hegel's axiom represents the rationalistic form of Trinity, and therefore can be mentioned in the same breath with the mental Christian Trinity only with reservations, we must still emphasize that the mental trinitary form is not to be confused with pre-mental ternary forms. Stated differently, there is a fundamental distinction between triadicity and triunity, that is, between trias and trinity. Only the Trinity has mental character. The unification of previously polar elements does not take place as in the mythical structure, but must employ the third element to effect the union. So when you go back in history and you see triangles in an era or location that hadn't quite the mental structure hadn't mutated yet. So it's not ancient Greece, it's not the pre-perspectival phase, and it's not the perspectival phase proper around the Renaissance. And they start using triangles. He goes on to make the point: any triangle where it feels like anything can just be our oh my god, arbitrarily interchanged, that's not mental consciousness structure. That's not the rational thought. Rational thought, there's a causality, there's a logic. If you simply just replace them and shifted out their place in the triangle, their position, it wouldn't make sense. Causality requires a certain if this then that, then if this then that. So be careful if you're reading history for that. Let's see. Earlier we ascribed the point or dot to the magic structure as okay, so he's going to talk about of course the point was the magic structure, the 2D flat circle was the mythical, and then the triangle is the mental, as I've already explained. He says, having determined the characteristic attribute of the magic structure to be emotion, and the characteristic attribute of the mythical to be the imagination, whereby the emotional attitude corresponds to magic man's relation to nature, the imaginative attitude of mythical man to his relation to the psyche, we now define abstraction as being the identifying characteristic of the mental structure. It corresponds to the relation of this structure to man, inasmuch as everything is in relationship to human measuring thought, and this thinking removes man from the impulsive world of emotion, as well as from the imagistic world of the imagination, replacing them with the world of mental thought, which inevitably tends toward abstraction. So emotion drives you in a very physical way. There's not too much thought happening. It's very automatic and instinctual. Whereas the imagination is similar to the metaphysical world of abstract thought, but it's different. No, we're no longer creating and shaping images and coming up with these sort of associations that are not particularly rational at all, but more symbolic. Now we're entering a different metaphysical space up here. Metaphysical just meaning in the world of thought. And now we're doing the whole is greater than the part, and the part's less than the whole. If A is B and B is C, then A is C. We are measuring, and of course, this is why you see the logic lords. They spur an emotion because one, they can't incorporate it into their countenance. Two, it does, in fairness, when you get super emotional, it's hard to think rationally. So abstract, this sort of dispassionate abstract thought is the hallmark way of, I guess, coming to forms of realization in the mental structure. No emotion, no imagination, we need mental, metaphysical thought. Let's see. The implications of the Trinity mentioned above, its tendency towards abstraction, as in the instance of the synthesizing act of thought, or towards quantification, an act which gains continuity only via repetition or reiteration, implications which at first glance seem incompatible are in fact a result of duality which measures the opposite and the contrast, a duality which makes the Trinity possible at all. Every act of abstraction results from the presence of measuring thought and the ostensible invisibility of what is being calculated, where every quantification results from the presence of measuring thought and the semblance of what is actually measured. So in the two realms that rational thought operates, metaphysically, I could say, yeah, the whole is greater than the part, yes. The measuring thought has been deployed in the domain of the world of thought. When I close my eyes and I'm the self, the ability to perceive and to be aware you're perceiving is engaged in abstract logical thought. That little world, that domain, rationality is present, but it's also present in the sciences, in history, and mathematics, because we are deploying measuring thought to measure the physical world, geometry, of course, physics, stuff like that. So he said this process is reflected in the reality of our world of thought. The symbol, always inherently polar and imagistic, is reduced to allegory, then to mere formula, as in the formulas of chemistry or physics, and even in the formulas of philosophy. So think about the math, the chalkboard behind the math nerd, and it's just every single thing is just equation, 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 symbol, 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 divide. And then, of course, in philosophy, you have these vast logical proofs that, Wittgenstein wrote. These are all using symbols, of course, and the problem is they have, like I said earlier, denuded them and in turn reduced them into just little, what is he saying? To mere formula. Symbols are reduced to mere formula. They used to be life and illuminating, an illuminating aspect of life that could drive the spirit of an individual or a civilization forward, but now they just become things that we can interchange and plug into our little formulas so we can come up with the rational truth. And then, of course, we're rationalists, so that's the only truth we consider. Let's see. In its extreme form of exaggerated abstractness, it is ultimately void of any relation to life and becomes autonomous, empty of content and no longer a sign but only a mental denotation. Its effect is predominantly destructive. So the infinite is a good example. It's maybe that's not the best example because I'm not a math guy, but there are these formulas, or excuse me, these symbols that signify these very complex abstract ideas. But the problem is they're so abstract and they're so divorced from any sort of external reality, contingent reality, America 2025, that they become just essentially useless. And another big problem that he's going to talk about is that the psyche worms its way back in and says, no, 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 if you go too abstract, you have not achieved some ultimate truth. In fact, um, I've just come in and interpreted it for you. And now you're going to conflate your psychic and subjective interpretation with the objective truth. Let's see. The process is also reflected in the reality of our objective world. The duality which destroyed polarity is compelled to bring forth the tertium just to assure its dualistic continuity. Exactly. So we bring in the third aspect of measuring thought to reattain the psychic unity and continuation that was so important in the mythical and the magical conscious structure. There is a reason for that. It was clearly attainable, and it was clearly something the mental structure struggled with, and it was trying to reattain it. And so, unity is important. You don't want to just endlessly divide things and sector things. And it doesn't make you a genius to do that, but I'm not going to rant. Ugh, my goodness. In this progression from the originally qualitative moment of monotheism, which is subsequently divided into the duality with its quantitative emphasis, merely begets the qualitative third, which must be ever created anew. Therefore, thereafter only what can be enumerated or dealt with statistically is of importance. Again, only that which is quantifiably measurable and consciously known is important. That's rationalism. That is bullshit. Don't follow it. It is surely no accident that this turn from qualitative valuation to quantitative judgment took place during the 15th century AD, the period of the formation of perspective. The destruction of the Order of the Knights Templar was most likely carried out because of their resistance to the mere quantification of gold, as they had recognized the last vestiges of the polar effectivity inherent in money, i.e., minted gold, as it was in antiquity. The gold coins kept in the Thesauros, the Greek treasury, were in antiquity effectual symbols of the brightness of solar consciousness. The gold coin was identified with the sun's disk, and the polar unity was reflected in the complementary nature of the two sides. This is huge. So think of this shift right there, the shift from qualitative valuation to quantitative judgment. I think I said this in my rationalism video. If I'm walking down the street with my friend and I pick up a piece of gold and I say, wow, this is amazing. I mean, this is rare. This is a sign of humanity. It's priceless. And he looks at me and he goes, no, dude, it's worth $100. That right there is the difference between qualitative valuation and quantitative judgment. I, of course, would have been the one making the qualitative valuation, and he would be the one making the quantitative judgment. So the Order of the Knights Templar, he said, was most likely carried out because the resistance to the mere quantification of gold. So they were willing to die and to have their order destroyed because they were not happy with the rational tendency to extract and remove meaning from symbols. So, like we just said earlier, symbols are reduced to mere formula and mere rational playthings. That's not the case in the mythic and non-perspective world. Symbols were willing to die for. You would live your life and be guided by symbols. You would never reduce gold, which, as he said, The gold coin was identified with the sun's disk, and the polar unity was reflected in the complementary nature of the two sides. They were effectual symbols of the brightness of solar consciousness. That alone they were willing to die for. So number one, not only is it a good example to show the shift from qualitative evaluation to quantitative judgment, the shift from the unperspectival world to the perspectival world, but also the importance of symbols and myth and all of that back then. They were willing to die for it, and they did not like the extracting and destruction of meaning that rational thought engenders. And I think people are rejecting that nowadays because of that. They don't like the nihilism that rationalism engenders. Let's see. He says later on, let's see. He says, apart from the fact that an isolating perspectivation is inherent in every abstraction, and that perspectivation leads to sectorization, whereby the phenomena, be they real in a mental or in a material sense, are not only divided and made measurable, but also quantified by a progressive subdividing and subsectoring, both abstraction and quantification ultimately lead to emptiness, indeed to chaos. At the point where they overstep the clarification appropriate to their nature, they revert metabolistically to the opposite of clarification, where they result in absolute void and absolute chaos, and not mere obscurity, as befits their quantitative character. The logical, no pun intended, endpoint, conclusion of rationalism, of the idea that only that which can be considered true by means of rational thought is exclusively true, as he said, is not just obscurity, it is chaos. You see this in the sciences with the chaos theories, and you see this in the humanities with postmodernism, skepticism, complete skepticism. One of my old buddies was a skeptic, the dude was a moron. It's complete psychic atomization, which will in turn lead to chaos and, what does he say? The absolute void and absolute chaos. That is your ultimate destination. Don't do that. Recognize you have to start to demarcate the boundaries of rational thought and say, okay, we're getting way too lost in the clouds. Let's come back to reality and balance and moderate rationality. From this particular point on, that is, from hyperdistinctness, either as mental illumination or as the measurable rendering visible of objects and things, the inexorable downturn into the quantitative mass begins, the gradual decline to where the contentual void, now autonomous, releases those chain reactions incongruous with the earth that engender complete disintegration. So he's talking about atomizing everything. This atomizing process does not occur only in the physical reality of atoms, which is only the more tangible form of a process of mental atomization already underway, and whose disintegrative nature is recognizable in the formalistic jargon of pseudo-philosophizing, where nothing remains of philosophical language. I love when academics attack people. So essentially, and this is, remember, this is in 1949, so this is before postmodernity, really. So even back then, Gebser was listening to all this nonsense, all this rationalist nonsense, and he said, it's exactly that, pseudo-philosophizing, where nothing remains of the philosophical language. I can't remember what famous academic philosopher, contemporary one, kept saying that philosophy is dead, it's dead. Oh, also, but sign up for my philosophy course. No, philosophy is dead because you're all rationalists, because you are relying on an inherently deficient mode of thought. Not only is it deficient to what is quantifiably measurable and consciously known, but you don't seem to recognize this little path you're on. So you're the person pulling from the magician's sleeve or whatever, and you're pulling out all the different colors of handkerchief, and it just keeps coming, and it's yellow, orange, blue, red, green, yellow, orange, and you're just doing that in perpetuity. You're like Sisyphus climbing the boulder. Every single time it will come back down. And it's completely destroyed philosophy, I think. Philosophy. Peter Sloterdijk wrote The Art of Philosophy, and that's another one who says that philosophy needs some help. I think part of this is rationalism and this obsession. And that's another thing. He mentions, of course, the splitting of the atom on the physical realm. There's arguments, of course, but that's going to be a big problem. That could be the end of our species, and I'm not joking about that. That really could be. And so we've divided and sectored on the physical realm so much that now we've split the atom. That could destroy our species. And again, we've done it so much that we've created skepticism, existentialism, and moral relativism and postmodernity. And those are civilizational destruction. They have engendered chaos. Now everyone is on no longer on the sex binary. and words no longer mean anything because there's no ultimate objective meaning of these words, and everything is chaotic and terrible. So this is the ultimate end goal of rationalism. Do not be destroyed by rationalism. Do I want to keep going? We will stop there, and then we'll do part three. Part three will probably be half the length of this. I just got home from work, so I'm a little tired. I want to thank you guys, as always, for watching this. The mental structure is a fascinating um, epoch, a fascinating aspect of the world and ourselves. And now that we, again, like all these structures, once you have a great understanding of the structures that exist within you, they are always operating within you. You have the potential to think rationally. You also have the potential to think mythically and magically and access the benefits that they afford and accrue. So I am not saying shun rationality entirely. Gebser is not saying shun rationality entirely. That would be foolish. It would be absurd. It would also make him the biggest hypocrite in the world because he has to put all this in mental terms, in rational terms. So that's ridiculous. We are not new age hippies over here who just want to regress back to the magical, mythical world. No, we want to transcend. We want to attain the same degree of unity in the unperspectable world, but we'll do it in the aperspectable world. Um, Rationality is a great thing. It's brought us a ton of great stuff. We're watching this on my laptop after all, but nonetheless, it does have problems. Just like irrationality taken too far has problems. Just like pre-rationality taken too far becomes a problem. So thank you guys so much, and hopefully within the next few days I'll finish up the mental consciousness structure, and then we will move on to the integral consciousness structure. You guys are the best, and I will see you soon.